In the rugged hills of ancient Israel, a dry wind swept across the land, rustling the leaves and carrying whispers of change. The prophet Elijah, known for his fiery spirit and unyielding devotion to God, was about to fulfill one last, crucial task. God had spoken to him, giving him clear instructions. Go and anoint Elisha, the son of Shaphat, as your successor. Elijah's journey took him to a quiet field, where a young man named Elisha worked tirelessly behind a pair of oxen. The air was thick with the smell of soil, and the rhythmic sound of the plow cutting through the earth seemed to match the beating of Elisha's heart. He was a man of the land, dedicated, diligent, and content in his simple life. But on this day, his life was about to change forever. Elijah approached, his presence like a shadow across the field, casting a moment of silence that swallowed the usual clamor of farm work. Without a word, he removed his rough, worn cloak, his mantle, the symbol of God's calling, and laid it across Elisha's shoulders. Elisha froze, feeling the weight of the mantle and the significance it carried. It was more than a simple garment. It was a divine invitation, a calling that could not be ignored. Elisha knew in that moment that God was asking him to leave behind everything he knew, his family, his fields, his oxen, and follow a new path, one that would lead him to become God's voice in Israel. But this decision was not made lightly. Elisha turned to Elijah, his face a blend of uncertainty and resolve. He asked for a moment to say goodbye to his parents, to leave behind the life he had known with respect and finality. And then, in a gesture that marked his commitment, he slaughtered the oxen and burned the plow, offering a sacrifice as a symbol of his complete break with the past. As the smoke of the sacrifice rose into the sky, Elisha joined Elijah, leaving the familiar fields for the unknown journey that lay ahead. From that day on, he would walk a new road, learning from the seasoned prophet, preparing to one day carry the mantle of prophecy himself. This was the beginning of Elisha's story, a story marked by faith, sacrifice, and the promise of a greater purpose. It was a moment that would set the stage for the miracles and challenges that awaited him, as God's chosen prophet for a new era in Israel. And so, Elisha walked alongside Elijah, step by step, through sun-scorched valleys and along winding mountain paths. As they traveled together, Elisha listened intently to the words of the older prophet, absorbing the wisdom of a lifetime spent in the presence of God. Each day was a new lesson, and Elisha's understanding of the divine deepened. But life with Elijah was not easy. Elijah was a man forged by fire, someone who had faced down kings and called down rain from a sky that seemed to be sealed shut. He had seen God's power move mountains, and he carried the weight of his calling heavily. Elisha, now in his shadow, felt the intensity of this burden and wondered if he could ever carry it himself. Still, Elisha never looked back. His heart burned with a new purpose, and his days of plowing fields felt like a distant memory. He walked with the same determination that had once driven his oxen, but now his path led him into deeper mysteries, visions, miracles, and the challenges of speaking God's truth to a stubborn nation. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, with the stars glittering like ancient promises above them, Elijah turned to Elisha with a serious look in his eyes. He could see the spark of readiness in his young apprentice, and he knew the time was coming when Elisha would need to stand on his own. "Remember, Elisha," Elijah said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "The path of a prophet is not a path of ease, but it is the path of those who are chosen. You have given up much, but greater things are yet to come." Elisha nodded, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames. He knew that his journey had only just begun, and though he had left behind the fields of his youth, he had embraced something far greater, a calling that would shape his destiny and, through him, the fate of Israel. Their bond deepened in those quiet moments, in the spaces between words, where understanding flowed. Elijah saw in Elisha a heart willing to serve, and Elisha found in Elijah a mentor like no other, a guide through the mysteries of the divine. And so, with each step they took, Elisha grew closer to the mantle that had been laid on his shoulders. He carried it not just as a symbol of Elijah's legacy, but as a promise of the future, one that would soon unfold in ways he could never have imagined. As the days passed, the sense of an ending lingered in the air between them. Elijah and Elisha traveled together until they reached the banks of the Jordan River. The water flowed steadily, its current strong and unyielding. There, a quiet tension filled the space between the two prophets. Elisha knew that a great change was coming, though he couldn't fully grasp what it meant. Elijah, with his ever-stoic gaze, took his mantle and rolled it tightly in his hands. With a swift, confident motion, he struck the water. The river, which had flowed uninterrupted for generations, suddenly parted, making way for them to cross on dry ground. Elisha watched in awe, but the miracle was overshadowed by a growing sense of finality. He followed his mentor across, each step feeling heavier than the last. On the other side, as they stood on the dry, barren ground, Elijah turned to face Elisha. His expression softened, the hard lines of his face giving way to a rare moment of warmth. He asked, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Without hesitation, Elisha replied, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." It was a bold request, one that spoke to his desire not just to continue Elijah's work but to carry it even further, to bear the weight of the mantle with the strength he knew he would need. Elijah's eyes gleamed with approval, but he answered with a solemn warning. "You have asked a difficult thing. Yet, if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." As they walked together, suddenly, a blinding light split the sky. A chariot of fire, pulled by horses of flame, appeared between them. The air crackled with heat, and the earth trembled beneath their feet. Before Elisha could react, a whirlwind lifted Elijah, pulling him up into the heavens, the flames of the chariot carrying him beyond the sight of men. Elisha stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes straining against the light until Elijah was gone. The air grew still again, and in the silence that followed, only the echo of the whirlwind remained. He looked down and saw it, the mantle, Elijah's cloak, lying in the dust where his mentor had stood just moments before. Elisha bent down, picking up the mantle with trembling hands. He held it close, feeling its rough texture and the lingering warmth of Elijah's presence. Tears filled his eyes as he realized the weight of what had just happened. His mentor was gone, taken up in a blaze of divine power, and now it was Elisha's turn to stand alone. But he did not remain in that moment for long. Gripping the mantle, he returned to the banks of the Jordan. The river still roared before him, as if challenging his newfound role. Elisha took the mantle in his hand, just as Elijah had done, and struck the water. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he cried out, his voice filled with a mix of grief and determination. The water parted once again, making a path through the river. Elisha stepped forward, crossing on dry ground, just as he had done with Elijah. But this time he walked alone, with the mantle resting on his shoulders and the knowledge that his journey as a prophet had truly begun. With the mantle of Elijah draped over his shoulders, Elisha began to walk the path of a prophet on his own. The first days were filled with uncertainty, each step echoing with the memory of his mentor. But soon, he found his way to the town where a desperate woman awaited his help. She was a widow, her face marked by lines of worry, her eyes hollow from countless sleepless nights. Her husband had died, leaving behind debts that she could never hope to repay. Now, creditors threatened to take her 2 sons as slaves to settle the balance. With trembling hands, she reached out to Elisha, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Please, my lord, you know my husband revered the Lord. But now they are coming to take my boys." Elisha listened, his heart heavy with compassion. He could see the fear in her eyes, the hopelessness that had taken root. But within him, the Spirit of God stirred, and he knew this was his moment to bring light where there was only darkness. He asked her, "Tell me, what do you have in your house?" The widow's shoulders slumped as she replied, "Your servant has nothing there at all, except a small jar of olive oil." Her words carried the weight of her loss. Everything she had once held dear had been stripped away, leaving only this small, insignificant jar. But Elisha saw something more. A plan took shape in his mind, one that seemed impossible, yet he knew it came from God. He instructed her, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." Confused but trusting, the widow and her sons did as Elisha instructed. They went from door to door, collecting every empty jar they could find until their small house was filled with rows of jars, large and small. The widow shut the door, and with a deep breath, she began to pour oil from her small jar into the first empty one. And to her astonishment, the oil kept flowing, poured and poured, filling each jar to the brim. Every time she set one full jar aside, the oil continued, smooth and golden, like liquid hope spilling out into the room. Her sons brought her more jars, and with each one filled, her eyes grew wider, her breath coming faster. Finally, she called to her sons, "Bring me another jar." But they replied, "There is not a jar left." And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the oil stopped flowing. She stood in the silence, surrounded by jars of oil, each one a miracle, each one a symbol that she and her sons would be saved. She rushed back to Elisha, tears of gratitude streaming down her face, and told him what had happened. Elisha smiled softly, his heart warmed by the sight of her joy. "Go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." And so the woman did as he said. She sold the oil, settling her debts and securing a future for her family. The dark cloud that had loomed over her life lifted, replaced by a hope she had not known in years. For Elisha, it was a moment of quiet triumph. He had taken up the mantle of Elijah, but more importantly, he had embraced his role as a vessel of God's compassion and power. In that small home, surrounded by jars of oil, he knew that the miracles God could perform through him were just beginning. With the miracle of the widow's oil still fresh in his mind, Elisha moved forward, each step leading him to new challenges and opportunities to reveal God's power. His path took him back to the banks of the Jordan River, where he had once stood in the shadow of his mentor, and this time, he felt the mantle resting more comfortably on his shoulders. The townspeople of Jericho came to him, faces marked with concern. "Our Lord," they said, "look, this town is well situated, as you can see, but the water is bad, and the land is unproductive." The water had grown bitter, poisoning the ground and threatening the life that depended on it. Crops withered, and the once fertile land lay barren. Elisha listened, his brow furrowing as he looked out over the river. He could see the desperation in the eyes of those who came to him, and he knew that a simple solution would not suffice. But as he had learned from Elijah, there is always a way when one trusts in the power of the divine. "Bring me a new bowl," Elisha instructed, "and put salt in it." The townspeople quickly did as he asked, gathering a new bowl and filling it with salt. Elisha took the bowl in his hands and walked to the edge of the water. The river flowed before him, steady but tainted, a reminder of the hardships that had plagued the town. He poured the salt into the water and spoke words that carried both authority and faith. "This is what the Lord says, I have healed this water. Never again will it cause death or make the land unproductive." As the salt dissolved into the currents, the waters changed. The bitterness lifted, replaced by a new clarity that sparkled in the sunlight. The river's touch became gentle, no longer carrying the poison that had harmed the people and the land. Elisha stepped back, watching as the townspeople knelt by the water's edge, dipping their hands into the newly purified stream. In the days that followed, the transformation was undeniable. The fields turned green once more, crops began to grow, and the townspeople returned to their work with joy in their hearts. Jericho, which had known the sting of drought and death, now thrived under the blessing of its restored waters. But this was not the only time that the River Jordan would witness the hand of God through Elisha. Just as his master Elijah had done before, Elisha stood by the riverbank, holding the mantle that had been passed down to him. With a confident hand, he struck the waters again, and once more, the Jordan parted, making way for the prophet. It was as if the river itself recognized the authority of the man who carried Elijah's spirit. In these moments, Elisha's power became known throughout the land. He was no longer just the apprentice of a great prophet. He had become a force of his own, one whose words could heal waters and transform barren lands into places of life and hope. And yet, beneath all this power, Elisha knew that he was simply a vessel, guided by a purpose greater than himself. The river Jordan, with its flowing waters, became a symbol of Elisha's journey. Each wave and ripple a reminder that with faith, the most impossible obstacles could be overcome, just as bitter waters can be turned sweet. Elisha's reputation as a prophet grew, and so did the weight of his mission. But with that respect came moments of challenge and scorn. One such day found him on the road to Bethel, a town with a history of turning away from God's ways. The sun was high, casting long shadows as Elisha walked, the prophet's mantle swaying with each step. As he approached the town, a group of young men gathered along the roadside. They spotted the lone figure in the distance, his robe and solemn demeanor marking him as a prophet. Instead of showing respect, they saw an opportunity for mockery. Their laughter filled the air, sharp and mean-spirited, echoing across the empty road. "Go up, you bald head! Go up, you bald head!" They jeered, mocking not only his appearance but also the story of Elijah's ascent to heaven. Their words, meant to belittle and scorn, cut through the silence, filled with disrespect for Elisha's role and for the God he served. Elisha stopped in his tracks, turning to face them. The playful mockery faded as the young men saw the intensity in his eyes, a gaze that seemed to pierce through to their very souls. He could feel their contempt and the way it twisted the air around them. Elisha's heart burned with righteous anger, not for himself, but for the disrespect shown to the God who had called him. He spoke, his voice steady and unyielding, calling upon the Lord to judge the actions of those who mocked the divine. It wasn't about his pride, it was about preserving the respect due to God's name. And then, from the shadows of the nearby forest, two bears emerged. They moved swiftly, their growls rumbling through the air like thunder. The young men's laughter turned to screams as they realized the gravity of their mistake. Panic filled their eyes, but it was too late. The bears charged, and the consequences of their mockery played out before Elisha's eyes. It was a scene that left a heavy silence in its wake. The bears retreated into the woods, and the dust settled over the road again. Elisha stood alone, his face somber, reflecting on the power and the weight of his calling. He hadn't sought this outcome, but he knew it served as a warning, a reminder that the power of God is not to be mocked or taken lightly. The town of Bethel heard what had happened that day, and the message spread. Elisha was a prophet whose connection to the divine was real and not to be trifled with. His presence demanded a respect that ran deeper than mere words. And though the memory of the bears left a chill in the hearts of those who heard it, it also left a mark of reverence for the one who carried Elijah's mantle. As Elisha continued his journey, he carried the weight of that moment with him, a reminder that his role as God's messenger came with a responsibility to uphold the sacred. The road ahead was long, and there would be more tests of his faith and resolve. But Elisha walked on, knowing that each step he took was guided by a purpose far beyond his understanding. A purpose that demanded both compassion and a firm hand when the time called for it. Elisha pressed on through the lands of Israel, each encounter deepening the bond between himself and the people he served. One day, his journey led him to the home of a wealthy woman in Shunem. She was kind and generous, insisting that he come in to share a meal. Her hospitality soon became a regular ritual, and she even prepared a small room on the roof of her home, a place where Elisha could rest whenever he passed through. Touched by her kindness, Elisha wished to repay her in some way. He called for the woman and asked what he could do for her, but she humbly declined, content with her life. Yet, Elisha's servant Gehazi observed that there was one longing hidden in her heart. She had no child, and her husband was old. Moved by her unspoken desire, Elisha called her back and spoke a promise over her life. "About this time next year," he said, "you will hold a son in your arms." Her eyes widened with disbelief, and she could barely bring herself to hope. "No, my lord," she pleaded. "Please don't mislead your servant." Yet, true to Elisha's word, she conceived, and the following year, she cradled a baby boy, her heart filled with a joy she had never known. The child grew, filling the home with laughter and light. But one tragic day, while out in the field with his father, the boy suddenly cried out, "My head! My head!" The father, panic-stricken, carried him to his mother, but despite her desperate attempts to comfort him, the boy died in her arms. Grief-stricken, she laid her son on the bed in Elisha's small room and set out on a determined journey to find the prophet. When she reached Elisha at Mount Carmel, she fell at his feet, her voice choked with anguish. "Did I ask you for a son, my lord? Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes?" Elisha felt her pain as if it were his own. He immediately sent Gehazi ahead with his staff, instructing him to lay it on the boy's face. But the woman clung to Elisha, refusing to leave without him. So, together, they made their way back to Shunem, to the room where her child's lifeless body lay. When Elisha arrived, he shut the door, allowing no one else inside. The room was quiet, thick with sorrow and unspoken prayers. Elisha knelt beside the boy and stretched himself over him. Eye to eye, mouth to mouth, hands to hands. He prayed, pouring every ounce of faith and hope into his words, imploring God to return life to this child. Suddenly, the boy's body grew warm beneath him. Elisha stood up and paced the room, his own breath quickening as he prayed even harder. Then he returned, repeating the act of faith, stretching himself over the child once more. This time, the boy sneezed 7 times, and then his eyes opened. Elisha's heart swelled with relief and gratitude as he lifted the boy into his arms. He called for the mother, and when she saw her son alive, she fell at Elisha's feet, overcome with emotion. She then gathered her child into her arms, her sobs of grief turning into tears of joy. The home that had been filled with the shadow of death now overflowed with life once more. Elisha watched the reunion, feeling a deep sense of awe at the power that God had worked through him. It was a moment that transcended words, a miracle that reaffirmed the purpose for which he had been called. He knew that he was more than just a messenger. He was an instrument of God's compassion, a bridge between the divine and the human, bringing hope where there had been none. As he left Shunem, the story of the sunken hope restored to life followed him. It was a tale that spoke of loss, faith, and the miraculous power of a God who heard the deepest cries of the heart. And for Elisha, it was yet another reminder that with each miracle, he was fulfilling the promise he had made when he took up Elijah's mantle, carrying the flame of faith into the darkest corners of the world. Elisha's reputation as a prophet and a man of God continued to spread throughout Israel and beyond its borders. His counsel became sought after, especially in times of turmoil, and soon, his wisdom would be tested again, as war swept across the land. It was a time of tension, with armies gathering on the borders, and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah facing threats from the neighboring nation of Moab. Kings, warriors, and common people alike spoke in whispers of an alliance between the kings of Israel, Judah, and Edom, who had joined forces to wage war against the Moabites. But as their armies marched through the desert, disaster struck. Their water supplies dwindled, and the soldiers grew weak with thirst. Defeat seemed inevitable, and the alliance threatened to crumble under the weight of desperation. In their desperation, the kings turned to Elisha. The king of Israel approached him, his tone filled with bitterness and fear. "Has the Lord called us 3 kings together only to deliver us into the hands of Moab?" Elisha, seeing the doubt and panic in their eyes, responded with a stern gaze. He spoke sharply to the king of Israel but softened when he addressed Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, a man who still honored the ways of God. "If it were not for the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not look at you or even notice you," he said. "But now bring me a musician." As the musician played, a sense of calm descended over the camp, and the Spirit of God moved through Elisha. He closed his eyes, and a vision took shape, clear and vivid as the desert sky. He spoke the words that came to him, words that seemed to defy the reality of their situation. "This is what the Lord says. make this valley full of ditches. You will see neither wind nor rain, yet this valley will be filled with water, and you, your cattle, and your animals will drink." The kings and their soldiers looked at each other in disbelief. How could a dry valley in the middle of the desert be filled with water? But Elisha's presence and the authority in his voice left no room for doubt. The soldiers took up their tools and began to dig, carving out ditches in the parched earth. Each stroke of the shovel a small act of faith. That night, the desert remained dry, and the sky showed no sign of rain. Yet, as dawn broke, something miraculous unfolded. Water began to flow into the valley, filling the ditches that the soldiers had dug. It was as if the ground itself had opened up a hidden reservoir. The parched earth drank deeply, and the soldiers gathered around. Their spirits lifted as they drank from the life-giving pools. But the miracle did not end there. As the morning sun rose, the water reflected the red hue of the dawn. From the Moabite camp, it appeared as if the valley was filled with blood. Believing that the kings had turned on each other, the Moabite army rushed in, expecting to find their enemies weakened by infighting. Instead, they met the combined strength of 3 armies, now refreshed and ready for battle. The Moabites, caught off guard, fell before the swords of the united forces. Victory, unexpected and decisive, belonged to Israel, Judah, and Edom that day. Elisha watched from a distance, his heart steady with the knowledge that the real battle had been fought before the fighting began. It had been fought with faith, with the digging of ditches in a barren valley, trusting that God would do what seemed impossible. And as the armies celebrated their triumph, Elisha turned away, already thinking of the next place where his presence might be needed, the next moment when faith would be tested and a word from God could change the course of a nation's fate. For him, it was another testament that God's ways were beyond understanding, yet always faithful to those who dared to believe. As the victories of the allied armies faded into the past, Elisha found himself back in his quiet work of guiding, teaching, and performing miracles among the people. But soon, another crisis arose, one that brought with it a heavy weight of fear and uncertainty. The kingdom of Aram, led by a powerful king, launched raids into Israel, seeking to weaken its borders. Elisha, with his prophetic vision, often thwarted their plans. Time and again, he warned the king of Israel, revealing the Aramean army's movements and turning the tide of battle before it even began. Each time, the Aramean soldiers found their ambushes anticipated, their strategies undone as if someone could see their every move. Frustrated and furious, the king of Aram gathered his officers. "Tell me, which of us is on the side of the king of Israel?" he demanded, suspecting a traitor among his ranks. But one of his servants replied, "None of us, my lord the king. It's Elisha, the prophet in Israel. He tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom." Determined to eliminate this unseen threat, the Aramean king sent a large force of horses and chariots to the city of Dothan, where Elisha was staying. Under the cover of night, the army surrounded the city, intending to seize Elisha and end his interference once and for all. When dawn broke, Elisha's servant went outside and froze at the sight. The city was completely encircled by soldiers, their armor gleaming in the early morning light. Panic gripped him, and he ran back inside, his voice trembling. "Oh no, my lord, what shall we do?" But Elisha remained calm, his face serene. He looked into his servant's fearful eyes and said, "Don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." The servants stared at him, confused, unable to understand how Elisha could be so composed. But then Elisha prayed, a simple but powerful plea. "Lord, open his eyes so that he may see." In an instant, the servant's vision changed. The air around them shimmered, and he saw what had been hidden before. A vast army of divine warriors, horses, and chariots of fire, surrounding Elisha and the city. The hills were ablaze with the presence of God's protection, an overwhelming sight that dwarfed the forces of Aram. The servant's fear melted away, replaced by awe. He saw that they were not alone, that their enemies were surrounded by a power far greater than any earthly army. Elisha stepped outside, unafraid as he faced the approaching Aramean soldiers. He prayed again, this time for the Lord to strike the enemy with blindness. And just like that, the soldiers' vision faded, leaving them stumbling and confused. Elisha walked up to them calmly, his voice carrying a note of command. This is not the road, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will lead you to the man you are looking for. Blinded and disoriented, the soldiers followed Elisha without question, like children trusting a guide through the darkness. He led them straight into the heart of Samaria, the capital of Israel, where their sight was restored. They blinked, realizing they were now surrounded by Israel's forces, caught in the very trap they had hoped to set. The king of Israel, seeing his enemies helpless before him, asked Elisha eagerly, "Shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them?" But Elisha shook his head. "Do not kill them. Would you kill those you have captured with your own sword or bow? Set food and water before them so that they may eat and drink and then go back to their master." The king followed Elisha's advice, setting a great feast before the Aramean soldiers. And when they had eaten and drank, he sent them back to their land. This act of mercy stunned the Aramean king, and for a time the raids into Israel ceased. Elisha watched as the defeated soldiers returned to their homeland, knowing that true power did not always come from the edge of a sword but from faith and wisdom, even in the face of overwhelming odds. He knew that while he was a prophet, the real battle was fought in the unseen, where God's armies moved in ways that no human eye could fully comprehend. And so, as the sun set over Dothan, Elisha stood on the city's walls, looking out toward the distant horizon. He reflected on the quiet but mighty presence of God that surrounded them, a presence that could turn a siege into a lesson and an enemy into a humbled guest at a table of peace. Elisha's life continued to unfold like a tapestry of faith and miracles, each thread revealing the power of God working through him. Among these stories was one that echoed far beyond Israel's borders, a story of a man named Naaman, a commander of the Aramean army, respected and powerful, but suffering from a condition that no military prowess could conquer: leprosy. Naaman's body bore the scars and the white patches of the disease that slowly stole away his strength and dignity. Despite his position, he was a man plagued by the isolation and stigma that leprosy brought. But in his household, a young Israelite servant girl, taken captive in one of the Aramean raids, spoke to Naaman's wife one day with a voice full of hope. "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria," she said. "He would cure him of his leprosy." Desperate for a cure, Naaman clung to this glimmer of hope. He sought permission from the king of Aram, who sent him to Israel with a letter, gold, silver, and fine clothes, gifts to secure the favor of the king of Israel. But when the letter reached the king, he tore his robes in distress, fearing it was a trap. "Am I God?" he cried out. "Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this man send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy?" But Elisha heard of the king's distress and sent a message. "Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." And so, Naaman arrived at Elisha's doorstep, a commander surrounded by his chariots and horses, expecting a great spectacle of healing. But Elisha did not even come out to greet him. Instead, he sent a messenger with simple, almost mundane instructions. "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." Naaman's face flushed with anger and disbelief. He had imagined Elisha would come out, wave his hand over the diseased spots, and call upon God in a grand display of power. To be told to wash in the muddy waters of the Jordan, when the rivers of Damascus were far superior, felt like an insult. "I thought he would surely come out to me. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel?" He fumed, turning away in a rage. But as Naaman prepared to leave, his servants approached him with gentleness and reason. "My father," they said, "if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more, then, when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" Naaman paused, the truth of their words sinking in. Swallowing his pride, he made his way to the Jordan. There, he stepped into the cool, murky waters, each step a surrender of his pride, each movement a prayer for the impossible. He dipped himself once, twice, 3 times, each immersion echoing in the stillness of the river. On the 7th time, as he came up out of the water, he looked down at his hands and arms. The leprosy was gone. His skin was restored, as smooth and clear as that of a young boy. Astonished, Naaman touched his face, his arms, his chest, hardly believing what he saw. Tears mingled with the river's water as he stood in awe of the miracle. He returned to Elisha's house, a changed man, his arrogance stripped away. He stood before the prophet, his voice humble, his heart overwhelmed. "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Please accept now a gift from your servant." But Elisha refused the gifts, his face firm with conviction. "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." He knew that this healing was not a transaction but a testament to God's grace, a grace that could not be bought. Naaman, humbled and grateful, asked for one more thing, enough earth from Israel to build an altar back in Aram, so that he might worship the Lord on his own soil. And Elisha blessed him, sending him on his way with peace. As Naaman's chariots disappeared over the horizon, Elisha stood in the doorway of his house, watching the dust settle. He knew that beyond the physical healing, Naaman had experienced a transformation of spirit, a turning of the heart toward the true God. It was yet another reminder to Elisha that God's work went beyond borders, beyond pride, beyond even the expectations of those who sought him. And so, the story of the commander who dipped himself in the waters of the Jordan flowed out into the lands like the river itself, reaching far beyond where the eye could see, a testament to the power of simple faith and the unexpected ways in which God moves. The years flowed like the Jordan River, carrying Elisha through victories and trials, through moments of despair and bursts of divine power. He became known across the land as a prophet through whom God's voice and hand moved powerfully, yet with a humility that set him apart. The memory of Elijah, who had been swept up to the heavens in fire, always lingered like a guiding light, but Elisha had carved his own path, one marked by compassion, miracles, and an unwavering faith. As he grew older, his steps slowed, and the weight of the mantle settled deeper on his shoulders. He had seen kings rise and fall, watched God's hand in both punishment and mercy, and felt the burden of speaking truth to a nation that often resisted it. Yet he never faltered, knowing that each word he spoke, each miracle he performed, was a piece of a larger design, a design woven by God himself. One last time, Elisha lay on his bed, the years pressing heavily on his frail body. He knew that his end was near, that his time on this earth was drawing to a close. The mantle, worn and familiar, rested nearby, a reminder of the journey that had begun with a simple call in a field long ago. Even in his final moments, the work was not finished. The king of Israel came to his bedside, his face drawn with fear, knowing that the Arameans were again threatening to invade. Elisha, weak but filled with purpose, called for a bow and arrows. With trembling hands, the king bent the bow, and Elisha placed his own hands over the king's, guiding the arrow through the air. "The Lord's arrow of victory," Elisha whispered, his voice filled with the certainty of his vision. But when the king failed to grasp the full extent of Elisha's guidance, striking the ground with the arrows only a few times, Elisha's heart ached. He saw that the king's half-hearted effort would bring only a partial victory. Yet, Elisha's purpose had always been to show the path, even if others did not follow it completely. With his final breath, Elisha knew that he had done all that was asked of him. He had poured his life out like oil into the empty jars of others. He had parted rivers, healed the sick, raised the dead, and spoken hope into hearts that had lost their way. And even though his journey was ending, he understood that the seeds he had planted would continue to grow long after he was gone. When Elisha passed, his body was laid to rest in a tomb. Yet, even in death, God's power through him did not fade. For one day, as the story would be told, a group of Israelites buried a man near Elisha's tomb. When the man's body touched Elisha's bones, he came back to life and stood on his feet. It was a final echo of the life he had lived, a life where death and despair never had the final word, where the presence of God broke through in the most unexpected ways. Elisha's legacy lived on, a testament that miracles are not confined to one man's lifetime, nor are the ripples of faith limited to the shores where they begin. Through his story, the people remembered that God's Spirit moves like the wind, flowing where it wills, bringing life and hope and change. And though Elisha was no longer there to guide them, the mantle of faith he had carried remained, a thread in the vast and intricate tapestry of God's work among his people. And so, the story of Elisha became a story not just of a prophet but of a journey of faith that could move mountains, heal broken hearts, and open the eyes of those who dared to believe.